The National Poetry Foundation Decade Conferences, of which this is the sixth, began in the 1990s as celebrations of the synchronous, of the variety of writers at work in a single time, and of the commonalities and differences that define time, marking its writers as actors in history. Beginning with the generation of the 30s and then moving zigzag fashion toward the present, these decade conferences have suggested that to be a writer is to be a contemporary of other writers, one among many in a collective endeavor, a shared experience of time. Bringing this idea of authorship to bear on the 1980s, however, summons the ghost of a very different idea. For the National Poetry Foundation's own labors in the 1980s were focused on a different sort of conference. Celebrations of individual figures, a small group of modernist heroes, Pound, Yeats, H.G., Eliot, Moore, and Williams, for whom, by and large, the synchronous is insufficient. Poets for whom a diachronic and, indeed, polychronic approach is crucial. Contemplating the 1980s, then, I see two versions of history intersecting, one with depth, another with width. And at that intersection, I see a new conception of the author taking shape, haunted, however, by the earlier shapes that have long populated our art. Susan Howe, to my mind, is the great poet of this intersection, a writer who turns the very idea of contemporaneity this way and that, aligning herself now with the past, now with the present, and now, as a teacher, with the future. This is not the Poundian sustenance of tradition, a sequence of heroes and classics, but a seeking out across time for commonalities and differences, a task to which Howe brings the attentiveness and vigilance and fearfulness of a search party, aware of dangers, hopeful for survivors. As put by Howe in Europe of Trusts, 1990, an often cited sentence, quote, "I wish I could tenderly lift from the dark side of history voices that are anonymous, slighted, inarticulate," unquote. More characteristic still is the emphatic "my" of My Emily Dickinson, 1985, a work of passionate alliance with a figure who tenderly lifted herself from the dark side of history, risking anonymity and slight, and even, yes, inarticulateness. My Emily Dickinson is, for me, the book of the decade. Its emphatic, beautiful prose, forceful understanding of the topic, and insistence on the artist's perspective place it alongside Call Me Ishmael, In the American Grain, and Studies in Classic American Literature, all favorites of mine, and all outstripped by Howe in her impact on subsequent study. An impact only magnified by her sequel, These Flames and Generosities of the Heart, the single most influential essay in the 125 years of Dickinson's reception. The 1980s were a decade extraordinarily rich in poet critics and poet theorists, but Howe stands out in part because she embodies that much rarer spirit, the poet-scholar. She brings an historian's zeal for research and a philologist's care for particulars to her work in Poetics, where her judgments and conceptions check and are kept in check by the materiality of our experience. But I do not want to split Howe's prose off from her poetry. Her project is pursued across multiple genres, and she began in the 1980s to combine those genres in startling ways. She also began then to introduce her poems with prose pieces that have since grown from epigraph to monograph length. The weight and the distribution of language in her books, the texture and use of materials, have been as influential on other writers as her ideas. Howe's books are works of visual art, and this makes it all the more surprising and impressive how powerfully they are realized in her readings. Articulation of Sound Forms in Time, 1987, is a Howe title that captures superbly the sculptural music of her poems, which Howe achieves in oral performance and on the page alike. Here, too, one can sense her moving across genres in pursuit of a goal. These goals have changed, perhaps, since the 1980s, in their particulars certainly, but the pursuit continues, more intensely than ever, leaving an ever richer textual record. From frame structures, early poems 1974 to 1979, one can see the high ground she already occupied as she began work in the 80s. Work that is largely gathered in the Europe of Trusts, Singularities 1990, and the Nonconformists Memorial 1993, which take us into the 90s, a decade that also saw the birthmark, Unsettling the Wilderness in American Literary History 1993, and Pierce Era 1999. More recently, she has published The Midnight 2003, Souls of the Labadee Tract 2007, and That This 2010, the last of which earned her the Bowling Prize in American Poetry. It is my honor and pleasure to give you tonight a poet whose work dignifies our sordid epoch. Please join me in welcoming Susan Howe.